Thank you for coming to my breakout and for signing up for it. There's a bit of a silent competition amongst the breakout speakers for what is known as the big room. And we are, if you didn't know, in the big room. And that has to do with the amount of sign-ups you get for your breakout. So thank you to every single one of you for helping me win the big room. I really appreciate that. I do have to admit, though, that you may be signed up for this talk under false pretenses because I don't get to name the talks. I might oversee the podcast network, but I don't name any of the shows. I don't do any of that creative stuff. I'm not very good at it. Who is good at it is Dan Price, and Dan is very good at it. And when he asked me what I wanted to do for Here We Still Stand 2021, because that's what this conference was supposed to be. It was supposed to be in 2021, not 2022. I told him that I wanted to do Philip Melanchthon and the significance of the 1521 Loci communes. And Dan looked at me like I was a crazy person. He said, nobody's going to show up to that, Caleb. Nobody's going to show up. And I was like, well, I got to be honest with you, Dan. Not only should that be the name of my breakout, but that's probably what you should name the entire conference. And he looked at me like I was an even crazier person. And I went around for months before the name was planned, trying to convince people that Here We Still Stand 2021 had to be about Melanchthon's Loci communes. And that's because, no offense to Luther, I love Luther. I co-host a podcast with Steve Paulson, who never stops talking about Martin Luther, and so I get a lot of Luther. But I don't think that the most influential thing that happened in 1521 was the Diet of Worms. I think the Diet of Worms is this amazing moment of bravery, an amazing moment for the story of the Reformation, where Luther says, "Here I stand, I can do no other," and he bravely stands up against the Holy Roman Empire and faces his death potentially, and it's this firebrand moment. But I don't think it's the most theologically influential thing to happen in 1521. And after all, Here We Still Stand is supposed to be a celebration of the Reformation every year, and we have to pick the thing worth celebrating, and that thing has to be Melanchthon's 1521 Loci. So thank you for coming to my celebration of Philip Melanchthon here today. And so now it's my job to explain to you why the 1521 Loci. This little textbook is really the most important thing that happened in 1521. And really it comes down to what Dan very cleverly was able to rename my talk from Philip Melanchthon and the importance of the 21 Loci to the commands, or the language of commands and promises. That is the thing that ends up making the 21 Loci so special. And I think most of you probably saw commands and promises and knew that that was a synonym for law and gospel, and being good Lutherans and being good Luther admirers, you went, all right, this is an easy talk to go to. I'm going to the law and gospel talk. This is going to be perfect. But Melanchthon is really one of the first players to give us this term, to give us law and gospel, not just as categories, but as central elements of what will become the Lutheran Reformation. It starts with moments like the publication of the 1521 Loci that take theological categories that have existed for the entirety of the history of the church, like law and gospel, and actually move their location and their use in order to become these central points of theology. So in Lutheranism, we frequently like to talk about linguistic turns. And I think that's why the language of command and promise is appropriate for a breakout like this, because Lutheranism is focused and wants to understand the linguistic turns that we made. Justification is a linguistic turn. Righteousness is a linguistic turn. And of course, law and gospel are linguistic turns. These are terms and words that are going to have new life and new meaning during and after the Reformation. But one of the mistakes that we make with a category like linguistic turn is instead of hearing turn, we hear linguistic invention. We hear justification and we see it as a Reformation doctrine, and we think the doctrine of justification or the category of justification popped up overnight in Martin Luther's head and became real just in the Reformation. And the same thing with law and gospel. We like to, as Lutherans, pat ourselves on the back and go, yep, we gave the world law and gospel. You're very welcome. You're very welcome to every, sort of member of the Reformation, evangelical out in the world who likes to toss law and gospel around. That was us. But linguistic turn is not linguistic creation, and it's not the first uses of these words. Really what it is a return to the biblical sense of these words. So when we talk about linguistic turns in the Reformation, we're talking about returning, very similar to repenting. We're being returned to a biblical use of words like law and gospel, command and promise, justification and righteousness. And so when we do Reformation history, when we talk about Reformation theology, I think it's a good practice to remind ourselves of that these are not inventions, but a return back to something biblical. And so I think this is where, for command and promise, for law and gospel, Melanchthon really comes in, is in the process of return. So now let's go into 1521 and see who and where Melanchthon is at this point in his life. By 1521, Melanchthon is not the right-hand man of Martin Luther yet. This is sort of what he gets known as. He has a progression, right? He becomes right hand of the Lutheran Reformation, and then for many he becomes the traitor of the Lutheran Reformation. But this has not happened yet. Right now he is just a young kid. He's actually in 1521 younger than I am now. I'm 27. Melanchthon is 22, 23 years old in 1521. He's not very old, and he's only been in Wittenberg for a very short period of time, since the later half of 1519, so not very long. And he was sent to Wittenberg, not sort of his own devices, but because he was not very good at making friends. Melanchthon was horrible at this his whole life. I talk about Melanchthon's legacy all the time, and it's about cleaning it up often. He didn't make friends when he was a young man, he didn't make friends when he was an old man, and he really hasn't made friends since he's been dead. And so here we are, and Melanchthon in 1519 is completing a master's degree at the University of Tübingen, and he's a young hopeful, hoping to turn this master's degree into some doctoral work. But while he's been doing this master's degree, he's been being exposed to Luther. He's been exposed to Luther in person in some debates. Melanchthon was present at the Leipzig debate, for instance, as just a background character, as just an observer. He has read Luther's theses, and Melanchthon has also been exposed to Erasmus's Greek New Testament. And Melanchthon happens to, at the university, and for his entire young life up until now, been primarily a humanist student of Greek and mastering the Greek language and the Greek classical authors and what we would today call the classics as a discipline. And so he's exposed through his mastery of Greek to Erasmus's Greek New Testament, and he's exposed to Luther, and Melanchthon is walking around the university going, hey guys, I think Luther might be right. I think he might be onto something. Every one of these debates he comes to, everything he says is, it's in line with Scripture. It's in line with what this New Testament is saying, that this Greek New Testament is saying. And it starts with probably these universally things that we kind of pass over now, like the change from the Latin translation of the Bible to do penance. And that starts, Erasmus sees this, but Melanchthon sees it, and he sees Luther, and he's going, this is great stuff. Well, his professors at the University of Tübingen do not like this one bit. They do not like his fascination and his defense of Luther, and they want him gone. And Melanchthon has an uncle. His uncle's named Reuchlin. Reuchlin is a very famous humanist. He's right up alongside Erasmus in terms of fame. Instead of Greek, though, he's a known Hebraist, which was not common for Christians in the medieval period to be studying. And Reuchlin is the tutor of Melanchthon in his young years and takes care of him and gets him assigned to universities. And he sees all this trouble at the University of Tübingen and the trouble Luther's causing him. And he decides, you know what? I'm going to make a phone call. He can't make a phone call, but he's going to make a phone call. And he's going to get Melanchthon sent to Wittenberg to sort this thing out here. He's going to get him he's going to finish his master's degree. He's going to be quiet for a couple of months, get the master's degree done, and then he's going to be sent off to Wittenberg. And at Wittenberg, it's going to be like a scared straight program. It's going to be like throwing his butt in jail. He's going to see Luther in person. He's going to be exposed to this annoying, sharp monk. And he's going to realize, you know what? I don't really want anything to do with this Reformation. I'm just going to go back to being a humanist. I'm going to go a little farther north, go hang out with Reuchlin, and this whole Luther mess will be over. And as we know, that is not how the story goes. Young Melanchthon gets drafted very quickly into Luther's army, and very quickly, basically immediately after 1521, becomes his head general in this theological debate. But Melanchthon, again, is sent to Wittenberg not as a theologian, but as a professor of Greek. This is his subject. It's the Greek language. He gets hired to teach language there. And he's teaching for a year and a half, 2 years, and he's really not satisfied teaching Greek. He has these ideas from Luther running in his head. He's now been with Luther. He's now been traveling with Luther, and he's reading the New Testament constantly, and he's wanting to dip his toe into teaching theology. He's not called to teach theology, but he really wants to teach it. And at this point, he's got the fiery heart of a young man, and he comes up with a sneaky way to teach this, a very, very sneaky way to teach this. He goes, I'm going to start lecturing in Greek from two of the greatest authors who ever lived. I'm going to lecture from Homer. Every student needs to know his literature and his poetry. Homer is the master, and if you don't know Homer, you don't know Greek. And he goes, and I'm going to teach from the Apostle Paul. And this is where he sneaks in his theological education. This is where he starts sneaking in theological lecturing. And as these lectures go on, less and less of it is just basic Greek grammar as we're reading through the epistles, and more of it is Melanchthon expounding on the Apostle Paul, and these become very popular lectures. People are overhearing, and there's stories that the room that Melanchthon was teaching in would be so full of people that the doors would be pushed open and pouring out into the hallways so that people could hear him reading Romans and teaching from Romans at this point. And his students are eating up every word. They've ignored these Greek lessons now. We're doing theology. This is exciting stuff. And they're writing everything down, word for word. Better notes than I have ever taken in my whole life. These students are putting together. And not only are they putting them together, they're sharing them after class. They're putting them together in books. They're secretly getting them printed, and they're disseminating them to all their friends all over Saxony. They're getting mailed everywhere. And Melanchthon catches news of this and has a panic attack. He has an absolute freak out. And for good reason. He's like, listen, I did not set out to write a theological textbook here. I'm teaching Greek after all. And he's reading these notes. And he goes, that's not right. I didn't say that. And, I didn't mean that. I would have said it like this. And he's just seeing things. It's making him uncomfortable. And so, and as Dan Van Voorst pointed out here, this was the era of printing. This is their big internet, once it's out there, you can't rein it back in. This would be like sending a tweet, getting 200 million likes, 500,000 retweets, and going, I don't really like that, I'm going to delete it. It's not gone if you delete that tweet. If you get a tweet that goes viral, it goes viral. It's not gone. And these lectures from Melanchthon are going viral. And so his only option is to, instead of complaining about how this isn't what he wished he would have said or how he would have written it, is to finally write it how he would have wanted. And so he goes out and does that, and that becomes the 1521 Loci, communes, theologici, which means the common topics of theology. And at this point, I am very sorry because that is not a very exciting name for anything at all. If I told you to run out to the bookstore, go buy my new book, it's called The Common Topics of Theology, I'm sure you would all leave this talk immediately and go buy 2 copies. Barnes & Noble would be calling me saying we got a bestseller on our hands. We need more copies than you can print. And so, I have to apologize for that. But yeah, he writes something called The Common Topics of Theology. At first glance, this really wouldn't be that amazing. A theology textbook full of terms and phrases, that's nothing new. But what is new is how and what this book does and organizes, specifically where Melanchthon puts or doesn't put certain doctrines that are always a part of your theology textbook, that have to always be in there, especially before and still to this day, after the Loci. Usually when you get a theology textbook or a systematic theology, you start with the doctrine of God. And your doctrine of God is essentially a list of attributes. Especially for the scholastics, what you want to be really careful of when you're talking about God is to make sure that you're not talking for God. That would be very, very dangerous. It would be extremely irresponsible to accidentally say something for God. And so the safe thing to do is to make sure that you just come up with a classic doctrine of adjectives that can't be refuted, that stand up to sound logic, make sure they're not only biblical, but that Plato would like them too, and you've got your God. So you come up with a God, you make a list about him, and he's there. Melanchthon opens the 1521 Loci by saying, there is no doctrine of God in this book. It's very weird. You open the table of contents, there's no doctrine of God. There's also no doctrine of the Trinity, another favorite of the scholastics, and usually the second page of your systematics textbook, because we can make another nice little adjective list full of coherent arguments that philosophers like as well. And so we can sit there and do that with those two, and they're conspicuously missing, and Melanchthon knows that people are going to notice that these are missing. And so he makes a very small comment. It's very nice. He goes, everything that can be known of God is revealed in the commands and in the promises. And as you go through that table of contents, you'll notice there's a subheading, commands and promises. And like I was mentioning before, that's not because these are new terms. These aren't brand new words. Every systematic theology before Melanchthon had commands somewhere in the text and had promises somewhere in the text. But what they didn't have was a text completely determined by commands and promises, where they're put not just in the spotlight, but they determine who God is. They tell you who God is. This is supposed to be the most important doctrine. This is supposed to be the one we spend the most time on, and you've spent no time on it. And so Melanchthon tells us, I'm going to spend all the time on it, but we're going to do it under these rules, commands and promises. And this is a turn that he gets from Paul in Romans, because the Loci is based off of these lectures in Romans. And what's specifically important about commands and promises is not that they are descriptions about God, another two things to put in their attribute list. God is a command, God is a promise, something like this. But that God speaks with commands and does with commands, and that God speaks with promises and does with promises. Specifically, that God is commands and promises to you, his face that you see, that you hear is a command and is a promise. And so that, we take something like law and gospel for granted today, but this is a massive return back to the text. And I think it's a helpful corrective today too, because we are very quick, those of us in the Reformational tradition, to just toss around law and gospel willy-nilly. Law is everything bad. Law is everything mean. Law is everything we don't like. Law is especially everything we don't like that our preacher said on Sunday. That's law, for sure. And gospel is everything nice. Gospel is love. And gospel is everything I liked that my preacher said that I agreed with. That's gospel. And when we look at what Melanchthon says, we don't get to just sit here and assign law and gospel to things we don't like or things we do like, things we think in the text are law, things we think in the text are gospel. He's insistent that command and promise specifically are the shape of law and gospel, and that they're things being done to you. You know you have a command because it's a command to you. You know you have a promise because it's a promise for you. These are not just things you go around sort of checking off the list. Yes, command. Yes, promise. They are things that make the text active and alive. And so this is not just a linguistic shift, not just a language of command and promise, but a preached command and a preached promise that he is seeing in Paul, and that really he's doing to his students. The thing that's captivating about the 1521 Loci, the thing that makes the 1521 Loci the most influential text of 1521 and the most important event of 1521, is that it begins to shape the way that students of Melanchthon, students of Luther, are beginning to talk and apply the text. And it really shapes the way that the Reformation goes by the time we get to Augsburg and the Augsburg Confession and the Apology. Because we can say that God is delivered to us in commands and promises. And that's really what the 1521 Loci does. It doesn't just describe that God has commands and promises. It says that God is delivered to you in commands and promises. And occasionally, this is where our good and our bad comes in, that's bad news, especially when it comes to the commands. The church at this point is not unfamiliar with commands. What they're unfamiliar with is commands that are actually doing things, commands that are producing something, and namely death. What they really hope commands are doing are motivating you to get moving, to do something for God here and now. They're not expecting commands to have actually done something to their hearers. It's all potential. It's not finished. And here we can say with Melanchthon and with the Apostle Paul that the commands of God actually do something. They deliver a terribly frightening God to you who's out to kill you. He's out to kill you. They reveal something about God. They reveal that he's righteous. They reveal all these lists of attributes, that he's righteous, that he's powerful, that he created the heavens and the earth, that he can uncreate you, that he has the power and authority to do all of these things. And it reveals something about you. It reveals something that you ought to be uncreated, that you are in violation of all these commands all the time, that he makes these commands and demands, and that no matter how much you desire to do them, you do not do them, that they do not enable a power inside of you to get active, to get moving, and to run towards this terrifying God with your arms open. Instead, what it does is it puts you to death. It actually demonstrates that you do not have the power to do what God has commanded, that you are nothing but a sinner. Thankfully, though, that's not where Paul ends. That's not where the New Testament ends. It's not where Melanchthon gets to end, because we have a second word where God again delivers himself to you, but this time delivers himself to you in flesh on a cross with your sins on him. And so the promise is not just a description of all the nice things that we like to see in the New Testament or in the Bible and all. It's not just God being kind. The promises are God in the flesh. And Melanchthon is very specific about this. The doctrine of Christ is wrapped up in the promise. The promise is a person. When God reveals himself in the promise, it's a man who died for you, for your sins. And we can point to him and we can see what he has done. And what he has done is given us the total picture of who God is, the entirety of who God is. We are not just left with a God of commands. We are not just left with a God of attributes, somebody who's described as righteous, who we know has the authority to do and to wield things against us. Instead, we have a God who chooses to die for us, who chooses us. And so the commands and the promises, again, are not just descriptions of some things God has done, but they are God's action and face in your life. And so what the 1521 Loci does is it does what no other textbook can do. It doesn't just outline things. It doesn't just give you definitions. It actually gives you a path forward with God, because it talks about, for the first time in a theological textbook, your relationship with God. It talks about your relationship with God under the commands, and talks about your relationship with God under the promises, so that you can confidently say, everything there is to know about God is known in these two words, in command and promise. And it's not just that everything is out there, and I might get to know it about God, but I know everything about God because of the commands and the promises, and I know everything about myself in Christ because the promise is God's last word, is God's final word, where he chooses you. And it's the significance of that, building up with what Luther has done in 1521, that brings us this hallmark year of the Reformation. 21 is a hallmark year of the Reformation, where the world is set on fire and we're accelerated not just to the sporadic debates and theses of Luther, but to a church, a group of people who come together to preach this word, to be a church and not just a series of correctors. And so without the 1521 Loci, we are set back years without the language for a church to use. The 1521 Loci becomes a document that trains pastors for another 50 years. It trains teachers for another 50 years to be people who do commands and promises to those who will hear them. And so this is why we have to rename the conference this year to Philip Melanchthon and the importance of the 1521 Loci, because without it, we wouldn't have conferences like Here We Still Stand, where speaker after speaker doesn't just stand up here and describe a mysterious God who's out there that you might be able to do something to please, but who can look out into all of the audiences and confidently proclaim that God has done something for you, that Christ took on flesh, took on your sins, died for them, and rose for you. And without students like Melanchthon, who accidentally are forced into publishing the most influential systematic theology to ever be published, we wouldn't have these things. And so we have to be thankful for the enemy of the Reformation, Philip Melanchthon, and do things, I think, to help recover his reputation as an evangelical and as somebody who did not just tell us to sit down and study, but who actually found the turn of the Reformation in a command and in a promise, and specifically in a final word of a promise. And so I think, that's all I really want you to know. I want you to know that Philip Melanchthon's important and that Christ died for you. So thank you for coming to my breakout. If you don't already subscribe to my podcast, now is a great opportunity to do that. You can pop out your phone as we end this breakout. You can go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, your favorite podcasting apps. You can go subscribe to the Thinking Fellows podcast, the Outlaw God podcast. And if you'd really like, you can go to the bookstore, and I believe my translation of Luther's Heidelberg Disputation is in there. It's a small translation, so you'll be able to read it all in one night. You go read it tonight. And then there's some commentary on the theses in there that I and Kelsey Climbera edited together. And you can go get that at the bookstore. But thank you for coming to the breakout, and I hope you guys have a good rest of your day.